Well, I'm Geoff from King's College London. I'm an archivist, which means I'm a jack of all trades and master of none. No. And then this is my colleague Tam, who is from Cradle of English, which is a company that, well, you can talk about it in a second, what you do exactly. So I've been involved in this space for quite a few years. I'm no expert. But years ago, I developed an app to do with Florence Nightingale in London, and that developed all sorts of techniques and so on that have gone on to be used elsewhere by other people. And my job, as Neil was saying, really is as a matchmaker. So I put people together and build communities of practice and that sort of thing. And that's kind of what this little brief talk is about. So it's about, we've heard here some fantastic examples of projects. And there are many, there are hundreds and there are thousands, in fact, in the UK and Europe and around the world that we could point to. One of the things we do need is a one-stop shop, whether that's Wikipedia or some kind of wiki that enables you to actually see what other people have done before and connect with the relevant individuals so that we're not reinventing the wheel all the time. But that's another thing, and that would be quite a useful thing for us to do. How can we make these experiences that we're seeing sustainable so that they're not just flashes in the pan, as it were, but that they have an afterlife so that we can return to whether it's Qatar or whether it is Malmesbury or whether it is a Titian. And shall we click, actually, if we double click on that, and that might...
Slideshow, yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's better. Yeah. How can these experiences, should they in actual fact, because one of the things that I train new archivists when they're being trained, they ask, well, how do we preserve everything? And you say, well, you don't. The first thing you need to understand is what you're not going to keep and what won't survive, as most of the things in our lives are ephemeral. 99.99% of our lives disappear without trace. The conversations we have, the experiences, the smells and sounds and everything are ones that pass us by and our brains filter them out. We might keep diaries, we might keep other snapshots in our phones, but that's all they are, is snapshots, so that we can help reconstruct what our lives were like if we're looking back at them, or subsequent generations can do the same. So what do we keep, what don't we keep? So I'm not proposing that we keep all these experiences, these immersive experiences necessarily, because some of them are, they're for an event, they might be for the World Cup or whatever, and then they're been and gone. But on the other hand, we don't want to lose all that expertise and all the input and the scholarly input that's gone into understanding a landscape or a painting or whatever it happens to be, because otherwise it's very wasteful economically, and it's wasteful in terms of our time and energy. We should be able to build on what we've done before rather than reinvent the wheel every single time. There we go. So essentially what we're doing now in this space is really just a continuation of what's been happening for 30 years in digital scholarship more broadly and digital humanities more broadly. So there are thousands of projects that have been funded and initiated. And Neil, probably more so than many of us, knows the challenge of what to do with those legacy databases and legacy websites and so forth. Often the result of very substantial grants from the AHRC and funding bodies. And in the past, sustainability wasn't necessarily properly appreciated by funders, so it wasn't required. That's changed. But it's still not a perfect playing field. And I know that from King's Digital Lab's point of view, one of the first things that you had to do when you set up King's Digital Lab was deal with dozens and dozens of very substantial legacy databases, major projects that have been funded on Anglo-Saxon coinage or whatever it happens to be, huge amounts of work and time and expertise that have gone into those. And at the end of it, all that's really been preserved might be a monograph, or might be a series of essays. There'll be a conference that may or may not, a major conference perhaps. Even so, papers won't necessarily have been preserved from those. The lessons learned won't necessarily have been preserved from them. And so the outputs are quite ephemeral. And they've gone into the expertise of the academics involved, and they take those on to the next job and the next job and the next job. But in 100 years, there may not be very much to show for it. And I know that you and your team here have been having to grapple with that central issue of sustainability of historical databases. and immersive experiences are an extension of that problem. So there have been a number of initiatives in recent years that have attempted to join up the dots a bit more, and we're familiar with some of them, and I've just mentioned here Europeana and the Towards the National Collection programs, and aggregation sites that have pulled together data from different databases like British History Online, that's taken material from Old Bailey Online and other constituent projects and brought it together to increase use. And if things are used, they tend to be preserved, which is an important lesson. Now, one of the things that I think is very, very important is that the different groups of people that are involved in these projects, and when the projects take on a broader life, they're not necessarily aligned in terms of the language that they use, or indeed their aims and objectives. So IT developers, to take that as a broad brush term, but that can be pulled into, layered into different types of practitioner, all with different languages and vocabularies and so on. So that's a catch-all in itself. People who are funding projects, people who are administering projects in universities, for example, local government, businesses, private, public, they all speak different languages. And what we need to do, and what I spend a lot of my time doing, is being a sort of Babel fish. So is getting people in a room, and it's as if they're speaking literally different languages. And that's to be a kind of, I suppose, a gearing mechanism to allow the different gears to work together into a seamless whole, so that people begin to understand and they go, I know what you mean by that now. I know what you mean by that now. Whereas otherwise, they're just different people on different tables. They don't understand each other. And it's impossible to build sustainable communities of practice unless people can understand one another. So a couple of examples of where we think we've done it right, I would say. One is the project that I run, which is a charity in London called A25. If you look at the website, it's terribly old-fashioned, it's being updated right now. As we speak, but I think the important thing is not that. It's not the glitzy technology, it's what underpins it, which is a sense of community and of usefulness to the people that are using the website. It's an aggregation website of archive catalogues for archives in London. So it enables researchers, people in their own homes, students and others, to cross-search all the archives and find material that's relevant to them. But it's also a community of the 150 organisations and institutions that make it up. And we developed it's a legal identity, so it's a charitable incorporated organisation. It has a cultural identity, and it's useful to its members, and that's ensured its longevity. So it's been around since 2000, which doesn't sound that long, but it's actually quite a long time for a site, a website, and a database in this space. So it's continually used, so that's nearly 25 years. And usefulness will probably mean longevity in one way or another. And then XRchiving, that I'm working together with TAM. So this is a group of individuals, so Cradle of English, King's College London, and Playlines, as Rob Morgan, that was mentioned just before by Neil, so public and private. And so we're looking to do several different things here throughout the UK, basically. And that's to develop, just taking a step back from the individual projects that we've heard about today, and that there are many, many examples of, and say, what can we do better together? And what lessons can we learn to really knit together these experiences into something that's much more substantial, that has benefits socially. So getting people back to work, dealing with underemployment and so forth, regenerating communities, so that might be empty shops and banks that we heard earlier with Malmesbury, regenerating cities, it might be health and well-being, so it could be dealing with depression, or it could be dealing with anxiety, using this sort of technology in a public space to do that. I'm always very keen, the heritage space, the cake is very small funding. If you can increase the size of the cake, then your slice is that much bigger. So if you can deal, I've always been a fan of the global challenges kind of initiative, which is you look at what are the 6 major challenges that the world faces, such as overpopulation or global warming or whatever it happens to be, and tap into the funding that's available, and you use your expertise and leverage it. And then you're not dealing with a cake that's the size of a fairy cake, you're dealing with something that's an enormous great cake, and your slice is 10 times bigger than you would have had if you just said, we just deal with heritage and we're heritage people and we're not doing anything else. No, you're not. You're about well-being. You're about improving people's life chances and so on. So it's, you turn the question around on its head, and that's the best way, so that you become experts in other things and become useful to people in other walks of life. And so what we've done with XRchiving, we had a launch conference last November, and the purpose of that was to bring together these disparate communities, practitioners, so developers, public, people involved in public spaces and regeneration, because outside King's College and the Strand, it's been pedestrianised recently. With the North Bank Business Improvement District, we're working with the Fleet Street Business Improvement District, so to see whether we can have common approaches that can be rolled out across all the bids nationally, so that this type of technology and interpretation can be used whether you're in Dundee or whether you're in Llandudno or whether you're in Truro or in London. At the moment that doesn't happen, which is insane, but that's because of the way that public finances and so on work. There's lots of different reasons why this doesn't work. And so we wanted to do several things through XRchiving. So one of those was bring those practitioners together through conferences and events and workshops, and to think about funding in a more holistic way. So we can go forward on that. And thinking about how this fits into the digital public realm, which Tam, you're going to speak about in just a moment. I'll try and get this to work. Let's see if I can. Yeah, here we go. Let's see that there should be a little video. Skip verification. See whether this is working. So if there's sound on here.
The poetry of history lies in the quasi-miraculous fact that once on this earth, once on this familiar spot of ground, walked other men living.
Doesn't
as
work.
Actual.
How do we? Is that it? I haven't got my glasses today, which is a bugger. Maybe you can see, I can't actually see.
Okay, so the escape is there. So we want to basically, it's still not showing, is it? So shoot. Let's go back to the tab.
Let's go back to it, yeah.
And can I just close that down?
Yeah. Oh,
great.
no. Yeah.
Sorry.
These are fantastic
pictures.
photographs.
I'm gonna have to.
There we are.
Yeah, there you go.
That's great. Don't ask me how to get back to the other one.
Today.
Yeah, we'll see. Or maybe we just go back on here from the beginning. Let's just scroll through those. So the key thing here is that we had some really good speakers. So we had private companies like Lego were there at the last conference, national bodies, English Heritage and so on, representatives of local government, app makers and software developers, and we had scholars and university academics who studied this. And we brought all these people together in the hope that we can begin translating their various languages and come up with a series of national approaches and strategies to think strategically about XR so that we can inform and advocate at a national level. And that's really the next step. And we're going to have another conference at King's this November. So stay in touch. We've got a website that's launching soon, so you'll be able to get all the information on that. I'll hand over to Tam now to talk about the next.
For a couple of slides, yes, we'll move that forward one. Right. Well, Cradle of English started in 2019, and it was very much different business than it is now. But one of the things that's emerged over these years has been this issue of sustainability, and no more so than because of what we've seen happen with COVID. Summed up in a word. Cradle of English was started because of my fascination with what happened in Fleet Street after the printing presses first moved in around 1500, and the relationship of those printing presses to the development of the English Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, and to a large extent Western civilization. But while I was fascinated with questions that preoccupied people like Samuel Johnson and John Milton and so on, and the politicians and all of that, COVID happened, and some very quick things happened that it's very easy for us to think now that, to remember how consequential these events were. That the tourism industry around the world tanked, airlines tanked, universities under threat because the students, not just universities, but the entire educational sector, because the students couldn't show up. So all of a sudden you had a problem with the tourism and hospitality industry, an opportunity with education because so much education was going online. And then we saw what we've got here, say here is the emergence of the digital public realm. Architects have been talking about the public realm for an awfully long time in terms of how the buildings work, the logistics, the transportation systems that make cities work. And all of a sudden, nothing worked. And people were working from home and wondering if we would ever return to the public space. This turned an awful lot of our questions at Cradle of English on their heads, just about the time I was getting to know Geoff and the people in his ecosystem and communities of practice. And we started talking about bringing the community together to address issues of what is the future of tourism? What's the future of tourism going to be when we all get back to being together again? And if we take, to the extent that we take tourism online, and we have all sorts of fantastic initiatives, a couple of which you've seen today, is that going to inhibit people to return to the real world? Are the problems with technology as they're changing through and beyond COVID going to inhibit people from returning from their comfortable studies to Fleet Street in the city? How is the invigoration of the digital public realm going to cause problems with the real world public realm? These were the sort of issues that we were addressing with the conference at XRchiving. So we were looking to inspire a renaissance of eco-friendly tourism, encouraging more people to engage with the wonders of English heritage, although it could be heritage issues anywhere in the world. But we were particularly concerned with the British position and London in particular, because that's where we were. But in broadening the environment in which tourism happens, could we get more people inspired to come to Malmesbury than ever would have done before by engaging with the world? And for the few people in the room now that weren't here when we had our Malmesbury presentation, and we had Geoff's immediate off the top of his head litany of key points that would make Malmesbury address the wider world. Those are all things that we can think of realistically now that weren't being thought of before. More people coming into Fleet Street in the city. The explosion in remote learning, extended reality, XR, and AI innovations, that's all very much part of what we're trying to do with creating what we've trademarked as a term we call Immersio. And I was handing out the little leaflet for the prototype Immersio we're developing right now. It was, in a sense, launched as a concept at the first XRchiving conference. We're looking to launch the prototype itself at the next one. But that prototype is based upon following Shakespeare's footprint in London around 1608, at the time that the Blackfriars Theatre was developed, and is a celebration of the quarter centenary this year of the first folio. For those who aren't familiar, the elevator pitch for the first folio was these two actors decided that without their work, Shakespeare's legacy would never be what in fact it's become, because there had only been 18 plays published in quarto. And if that was going to be Shakespeare's legacy, we would have lost all these other plays that hadn't been published at all. Macbeth and Twelfth Night, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra. And with those plays would have gone not only the scripts, but the subsequent performance history and the social impact of all those performances. So they got the scripts together, published them in one big book, and it didn't make very much money at the time, but now most recently we've seen one of the 235 surviving copies of the first folio sell in New York for $10 million. It's a big and it's a consequential book. And what excites us about it at Cradle of English, and by extension our friends at King's, what excites us about that is that technology, this combination of technologies and the work that we're doing with Digital Lab and with the Open University and with our principal investigator at De Montfort University, Gabriel Egan, who's one of the top Shakespeare scholars in the country. That work can be as consequential for the next 500 years as the printing presses were in 1500. Think of what's happened in the world because of what the printing presses have done from the 15th, 16th century onwards. And imagine how if we're looking back 500 years from now and saying, so what did AI actually do for you? What did all this virtual reality, all this lovely 3D panopticon extraction and so on, how did that all coalesce into a new ecosystem of communication and marketing and publishing that enabled us to do all kinds of things? What did it do for the tourism industry? What did it do for educational technology and so on? I mentioned Gabriel Egan from De Montfort, and he won't mind me telling this story very briefly, but one of the things that was most concerning for me when I was introduced to Gabriel after the conference was that he said, well, you know, I was the principal investigator for the HRC grant that established the Shakespeare London Theatre Initiative, anachronized him here as Shelt. 2008 to 2013, it took off. In 2013, in February of that year, if you'd understood the trajectory of wonderfulness that he had built into this model, you'd think, well, this thing's got a fantastic trajectory. And it's Shakespeare, for heaven's sakes. Oh, I got one of these. Here's the Shelt website. It's still visible today.
It's not coming up.
It's not going up. Oh, right. Yeah. So we got to go through this again.
Well, imagine a website.
No, it's okay. It's okay. We'll just talk to it. The point is, you can see this website right now, and you go to the top of the Twitter feed, and the last tweet is from February 2013. And then after that date, it just stopped. Most of the content is still there, but the links are not live. Not only they're not live here, but they're not live there. Because when the funding ran out, everybody just stepped away from the project. And I said to Gabriel, didn't this annoy you? The lack of sustainability in all these ventures, and think of the exciting ventures we saw earlier today. What happens if they just stop? Critical people go, the funding runs out. The communities of practice to which Geoff was alluding earlier, they break up for any number of reasons. What can we do to build sustainability into the business model of everything we do? Not just commercial sustainability, not just understanding the data, but understanding the net effect of all of these people coming together and doing good work. All that midnight oil that you were burning in order to do what if the project isn't there to be built on in 5 years' time? So behind all of this, in my mind, there was this famous quote that's become almost the foundation of my own philosophy of building businesses and so on. That John Ruskin, the 19th century writer, who said that we must measure ourselves as a civilization, not by what we have achieved, but by what we are now enabled to conceive. So it's the future of what we're doing. XRchiving is not just a bunch of librarians and archivists getting together with their data. Precious and fascinating though that is, it's what do we do with that? What do we do as a result of the fine detailed work that Neil's doing with Rob Morgan with the paintings and so on? How do we build on that? So developing this ecosystem and constantly re-examining What do we mean as a community when we talk about ecosystem? What do we mean by sustainability? What are the terms of reference under which we will ensure that what we have been doing, we can sustain forever? So as I say here, the trick will lie in immersive initiatives that stick around, and that's what we're trying to do with XRchiving. Just the, well, I'm not going to start getting into these because if I couldn't make the other link work, I'm not going to make this work. But Cradle of English, on the little leaflet I've shown you, it serves as my business card as well for people who want to contact me. But cradleofenglish.com is up there, and that particular link goes through to a slide deck. The slide deck tells you the entire story, and I could stand here for 3 hours and tell you the story of how we've got here. But I mentioned Crane Court for a particular reason. For those of you that know Fleet Street, there are about 8 little alleys that wander up off the north side of Fleet Street. And a lot of them they follow the footprint of the ancient city. Because after the fire of London, they had to rebuild pretty much to the old footprint because the people who had lost their houses hadn't lost their memory of where their houses had been. So when Christopher Wren came in with this great plan for how they were going to rebuild the city with all of these Parisian-style boulevards, the population was saying, "Oh no, you bleeding well aren't going to do that. My house is going to be there again." So those little alleyways are still there. And Crane Court we chose that for a sort of a prototype immersio, which is famous for being the first London permanent home of the Royal Society. And we were able to put up false fronts on buildings and reconstruct a gallows at the T-junction of Fetter Lane and Fleet Street, where for 130 years a gallows was put there to hang Catholics. So as Newton and his buddies were establishing the Royal Society, they were walking to work every day past the gallows. It's rather interesting that once we had the immersio produced on our website and producing web analytics that dwarfed the rest of what we were doing with our website, the immersio has been extremely popular, even though it's very much Janet and John in technology terms. But one of the tweets we had was from a lawyer who's actually working in a building at that corner. And he said, "I've been working in these chambers for 30 years. And it's shuddering thought to think that for all that time, there was a gallows standing up right outside my front door." Glad to have missed that. Anyway, so that's the big opportunity we're developing now, to develop this particular prototype on the first folio. And with this sort of technology, we think, for reasons that all of you know as well as we know, it enables us to address a diverse and global audience that we hope we can sustain, or use to sustain a network of immersive developments like this. And with that, I think that I'll hand it back to Geoff for winding up.
So there are a number of elements here that we're looking at, and Lego pieces that need to be bolted together. So one is around common standards around metadata and software, and we've heard, so there's proprietary software, there's open source, and organisations like the Digital Preservation Coalition and the DCHI and other ones worldwide have been looking at all this for years. So what we have to work with those umbrella organisations to understand what we need to do, and there's a lot of work happening right now with 3D and immersive standards. And so we need to bring those together so that we understand the implications and what's missing. But also it's things like the interoperability. If you're embedding objects that are archival or gallery objects in immersive experiences, how do you do so in a way that's persistent, and that you can connect those to underlying databases, so museum databases and other pieces of software, and to do so in such a way that it's sustainable in 10, 15, 20, 30 years time, or always bearing in mind the integrity of the original source data so that you can recreate things if you need to, like all the material for Qatar. You need to be able to go back to the original if your renderings no longer exist. And I think about common definitions as well, because people use terminology quite fluidly, not necessarily with a degree of accuracy, and they mean different things. So immersive is a case in point. What do people mean by immersive experiences? Do they mean a Van Gogh experience in London that is dizzying and has a particular, within a studio environment? Do they mean something that's viewed through Oculus? What do they mean by it? So there's a public awareness. There are two approaches to this. You either begin branding what we do so that people have an awareness of it, and they say there is this industry and a group of practitioners who work in this, and you advocate through cultural and creative industries and through the relevant government departments and marketing channels to do it so that you can sell your wares around the world, and people are aware of what you do, and somebody starting up a SME, small, medium-sized enterprise, they want to work in this space, they go to the people who know can help them do this. Or the other approach is that you bake in immersive methodologies into regular software and business and other processes, so that people are unaware that they're doing things in an immersive type way when they use their software. That's the approach we used before with linked open data, by embedding it in commercial software, so that when people are doing their work, they're creating this thing called linked open data, which is semantic. It's to make the internet smarter, basically, but ordinary archivists and others were doing this without being aware that they were doing it. And that's the other alternative approach. You either make people aware of the, it's like the Wizard of Oz, basically. Do you want them to see the workings, or don't you? There are pros and cons. So it's to dovetail into the existing ecosystem, so you don't reinvent the wheel. It's to provide use cases that are costed use cases, so that if it's Malmesbury, they want to know how much that costs. I want to do the same in devices, but I want to do it even bigger and better. What's in it for me? And I'll go back to my final point, which is, if you can think about the bigger problems that humanity faces, and see how the heritage interpretation industry can help identify and support solutions in to those problems, you open up whole new markets, and people understand that it's not just about history. I'm an historian originally, so I love all that personally, but there are a lot of people who aren't really that concerned with it. But they are concerned with it if it's their elderly relative in the nursing home, and this is going to help with their alleviation of their Alzheimer's symptoms, or whatever it happens to be, whatever the use is. And that's it. Sorry, we've overrun.
No. Any questions? Juliana. Oh, yeah, sorry, Jill.
It's absolutely fascinating. Some shape records and print, and increasing concern must be how that looks. What sort of traction are you getting? Are you starting to see people move in your direction, and is that understanding, or is it still relatively theoretical?
Well, in part, we're organising a workshop very soon in this space, and we're going to do a lot more in November. And we've got a couple of applications in the pipeline for funding to do more substantial work. So part of it is about advocacy and about networking kind of activities. I'd say, I think in terms of the immersive Shakespeare experience, that's really attempting to do something quite new, which is to look at, it's not just, it's a lot of virtual experiences. It's in the last 30 years are just virtual replicas of books, really. A website in one way or another can be seen in those terms. Is there something that we can do with immersive that goes beyond that, and to say, actually, this is bigger than the printing press? It's a new way of looking at, because it touches the heart, a new way of looking at the world around us, interacting with the past but the future. So you begin to break down the timelines, and you do all sorts of things that has cultural impact and social impact and educational impact. So something above and beyond what is just a virtual replica of a book.
I'd add to that in addition to the first folio prototype that we're working on, we're actually looking at developing a funding model for examining the impact of this venture. Not just this impact, the impact of the first folio, but of all similar sorts of works. So that whether we're doing something in the heritage space or health and well-being, as Geoff alludes to in that last slide, we want to have a better understanding of this industry we're putting together in terms of being able to say to private equity and investors that this has that sort of impact, that has that sort of impact. We measure this to get that ROI, and we get this to get that ROI. So we're understanding more substantively and responsibly what exactly we can do in building the future of all of these initiatives. And the last point, just to make one of my key points about history. I agree with everything that Geoff said. I think fantastic. But I would never want us to think that what we're involved with is just history or just heritage. Because everything that we're doing is not just about improving local tourism dollars back in our shires. But I think we've got to understand that history is a little bit like philosophy. It enables us to get outside the goldfish bowl of just our perceptions of today to understand where we've been in order to contextualize where we are. And then that establishes what I think is not so much a road to the past, but a runway to the future. And that comes with understanding history in a way that I think the immersive technology paradigm and smarter use of data can only facilitate. And that's why I think that our work is every bit as important as any other immersive application. And with that, I conclude my sermon for the day. We will now all sing.
I was just going to say, just put a spoon in. Europeana, collection of data, metadata, different things of art, all kinds of different things. Yeah. And there are other collections that are shared. So, am I right in saying that you're conglomerating or wanting to conglomerate more collections that everybody can share and take further and so on and have a better understanding of? Because I was introduced to Europeana a while ago and thought it was ace, absolutely brilliant. The fact that at my fingertips is all of this information, and then you've got the welcome body of information, and then you've got lots of other bodies of information that are stored digitally now. So, is yours going to be sustainable in going forward, i.e., or is it going to be sort of drop off the planet at some point? Do you see what I'm trying to say?
Well, our job is not to, there's the Europeana data model, and there are data models that underpin these different aggregations that have been developed, and they're all quite well established. There are all sorts of obstacles that we haven't got time to go into today about those types of approaches, IP, national legislation and so on, differences in legal jurisdictions, and sensitivity issues, and there are many, many other factors to consider. There have been a number of attempts in the UK to create what is effectively a digital public realm, and I've sat in on meetings many times on those with stakeholders like the BBC and other people that own or control large blocks of data, and it never works out. The problems are political with a small p, they are cultural with a small c, and they're things that you don't expect. They're not necessarily about data. But if you're talking about legacy data, that might not be modelled and structured in the right way, because at the time that work was done, people didn't necessarily appreciate, or too few people appreciated, the afterlife of the data. So it has to be done again. So there's an awful lot of public investment that has been wasted. But then there's investment that may not have been wasted because it's led to our understanding, it's added to the pool of our understanding of the cultural and creative industries, what not to do.
It is interesting, really interesting what you're doing. Thank you very much.